Alligator in alignment. Once again, I'm going to sing a song that all the women are going to disagree with me on. Here's a song I wrote about a woman who married the perfect man. And don't you women say a damn thing. I can hear you thinking. There's no such thing as a perfect man. Listen to this song. If you listen to my lyrics, you're going to agree with me. This woman found the perfect man. But let me say one thing before I do this song. It wasn't me. I saw my baby coming, walking like a queen. I saw my baby coming, let me tell you, she's in love with me. She told me that she loved me, says she always will. Say, hey now alligator, I want to be your girl. She took me by my hand, y'all, hey, and walked me down the hall. Say, hey now alligator, I'll be your one and all. Here's what happened. I got caught up in her magic, caught up in her spell. What did I do? I went and got the preacher. Oh shit. Now my heaven turned to hell. Let me tell you. Now I'm washing dishes. I wash the pots and pans. Stay home and watch the children while my wife goes out and dance. The perfect man. Now I wear an apron. I mow the lawn, do the groceries, change the diapers, wash the pots and pans. I used to be a lover, but that's over. Now I'm a mommy man. My baby coming, walking like a queen. Yes, she was. I saw my baby coming. Let me tell you, she's in love with me. She told me that she loved me, says she always will. Say, hey now alligator, I want to be your girl. Once again, I got caught up in her magic, caught up in her spell. What did I do? I went and got the preacher. Oh no. Then my heaven turned to hell. Here it is, 20 years later. I'm still washing dishes. I wash the pots and pans. Stay home and watch the 19 children while my wife goes out and dance. At least I've been busy. Now I wear an apron. I mow the lawn, do the groceries, change the diapers, wash the pots and pans. I used to be a lover, but that's over. Now I'm a mommy man. I remember when I was a young man, they used to look at me and go, look at Alligator. He got all the girls. I used to be a lover, but that's over. Now I'm a mommy man. Alligator in alignment. I've got a really special show today. Let me get in here for a minute. What are you tapping off about? Okay. In the very beginning of my podcasts, I did an introduction with Peter Turner. at Turner Studios. We're actually at Peter's Complex right now. But the second show I did was one of the most popular of all of the things that I've done so far, was with my friend Ted Schettler. On climate change. And when we did it, I told him, I said, well, we're going to have to come back and continue this. And it's been quite a while, but now I'm back. So I'd like to bring on Ted Schettler and also Nate Kanye.
You got it.
Got it. You guys come on over and sit out here. Nate did another show that we did that was very, very, very popular also. And he wanted to be a part of this. We were going to have a huge party and all of this stuff, but Peter Turner sort of under the weather, needs to rest at this point. So here we are. Ted, this climate change is not getting better.
No, it's getting worse. It's getting worse.
It's amazing that a subject of this importance. I mean, we're talking about the future generations here. It's being ignored, and I think I'm going to say this, and I could be wrong, but this is what I see. I think you can boil it all back down to that one thing that seems to ruin humanity: the love of money. The love of money.
Well, I think we have lots of evidence that the fossil fuel industries are at the core of this, and they have a lot of power and a lot of money, and they're not about to give up that power. And so what we're seeing happen now is a tremendous amount of organization going on in civil society to try to address various aspects of this climate crisis. But it's getting pushed back continuously by the fossil fuel industries, who see, the history unfolding over the next number of 50 years, 70 years, 80 years, that they intend to continue to mine fossil fuels. And if we stop burning them to create energy, they're moving into using the fossil fuels to create plastics. I mean, that's the get out of jail free card. So there's a lot of financial incentive to keep business as usual, and so I think you're right. And yet, it's gratifying to see a lot of civil society, both in the United States but also internationally, trying to confront this tremendous power of the industries that are at the root cause of the climate crisis.
Any words from you, my friend?
So I wouldn't say it's entirely about money, because thinking about this subject, I think it's a complex topic. I think if you really internalize where the climate is today, for a lot of people that don't follow it very closely, it's really frightening and sad. And there's kind of a grieving process, and I personally had a grieving process with it, actually moving to California 2.5 years ago, and just, in the heat of these terrible forest fires. I moved August of 2020, pandemic, world shut down, literally orange sky over San Francisco. Many people have seen those pictures.
Oh, yes, I saw that.
I just remember driving around Marin and holy shit, this is the most beautiful nature I've ever seen. And it's 90 degrees right now, and there's no fucking way a redwood tree grew up in this stuff. And just noticing the disconnect between the climate that I was experiencing and just looking at the nature, and this came up in a different era. And that was really, really hard for me to process. And I'm someone who's, followed the climate for a long time. I've, been very plugged into the urgency of changing the way that our society operates. And it still was just so emotionally hard for me to confront just where we are. And I think for a lot of people, who don't go their daily lives thinking about the climate, there's this process of wow, the way we've been living is not sustainable. The way that I've been thinking and operating doesn't work. And wow, we've done a lot of damage. And I think there's an emotional component of that too. And I think the money is totally playing off that for sure. I agree with that. But I think there's other factors too to unwind.
I think you pointed out the anxiety that so many younger people are feeling. It's really gotten down to quite young folks. Student age people who are really feeling it in a profound way. I mean, to the point that it's leading to clinical depression. And a sense of despair,
hopelessness.
That is in some ways serving to catalyze more activity, because now younger people are getting organized and speaking out about this.
And that's always a good thing.
Yeah, it is.
The younger generation, the ones who are going to inherit whatever we leave them.
Because when you guys grew up, there wasn't, like, I'm 30, Donnie's 25, 26, something in that range. And for us, this is just the world that we're in.
Yeah.
And you guys are, hopefully going to be around for a long time. But, like, when you were growing up, there wasn't this just, like, moment and this realization that, like, wow, like, the world's in some serious trouble, right? Like, you just went about your daily lives. It was a sunny day. It was beautiful. And this is just so present for people of our generation. And it, I don't know, like, it's in some ways, like, terrifying. But in other ways, you kind of... you make peace with it, because that's what it is, and you can't ignore it, and you have to do things about it. But I just think, like, there's much more of a realization that this is the world that we're living in for people like me and like Donnie.
Well, that's also leading to some really innovative experiments in how to build resilience, so that people are going to be more prepared for the climate change that's already happening, in some places more than others, depending on what sort of experiments they're able to carry out. But one of the things you and I talked about last time, Alligator, was the fact that not all communities are equally impacted by the climate change, and that happens for a variety of reasons. It makes it very difficult for some communities to respond compared to others.
Yeah, that inequality of how climate change affects people opens up another whole can of worms. That's pretty ugly too. Unfortunately, it seems like that most of the most polluted areas seem to be where the poor happen to live.
That's actually quite true. Yeah, I mean that is exactly right. You have more air pollution and more hazardous waste sites contaminated with a whole variety of things in areas where disadvantaged communities tend to be located. That's true across the country, and it's true globally as well in many countries. So you have increased exposures in communities that are located in these places, and then an increased risk of some of the impacts of climate change. So increased exposure to the ravages of intensifying storms or wildfires that you mentioned, and decreased ability to respond to it when it happens, as well as increased vulnerability because of underlying health status. So you sort of, in a sense, have sort of a triple whammy. You have increased exposures, decreased ability to respond, and increased vulnerability. And that's sort of a recipe for real trouble in many communities.
Well, that's, almost, when I hear you say that, a lot of that almost feels like it has a U.S. lens to it. I know it doesn't, but like the really, in the U.S. that's definitely true for sure. And even if you looked at rates of houses with air conditioning in Houston and did a socioeconomic overlay of that, it would be unsurprising and kind of sad, very sad. But the big communities that are going to be the most affected by this are the communities in the global South, which have whether it's Africa or it's South America or because the heat is going to get so extremely unbearable in those places. 120 degree plus heat waves extended for potentially weeks on end, and it's already starting to happen. And the resources of those countries to combat that are very, very low. So when you apply the global lens to it, and there's, I don't know what the statistic is, but when I was coming up, it was always 2 billion, 3 billion people live on less than $2 a day, and those 2 or 3 billion people tend to live in the global south, and they're going to be extremely impacted by this, even more so than Americans.
Yeah, it's even a bigger disparity. I agree with that. Yeah, and if you live in a situation where you're living on a few dollars a day, and then drought hits or some other climate related event, you're less able to respond to it. I mean, what are you going to do? You become a climate refugee in some sense, and all kinds of insecurities follow from that.
Yeah, and your government can't just print $3 trillion because
Exactly.
people had to stay home for a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
And these changes are here. They're happening right now. That we were warned about 50 years ago. And and being here in Bolinas, we're right down the road from a perfect example of climate change, Stinson Beach. Stinson Beach, they're going to have to move. They've already had plans for the last couple of years. They're already moving these plans ahead. They're going to have to move all of those buildings off the beach up to the side of the mountain, because they say in 20 years, it's all going to be underwater.
Well, some of the storms that we had this winter just passed flooded a number of homes and businesses in Stinson Beach.
And that didn't used to be the way it was. That just was not the way it was. So that's, it's happening right now. When you got a community like this that know that it is imperative that they start moving now to move their population closer back up to the side of the mountain, because if they wait, it's going to be too late. These, climate change is here, and the only optimistic thing we can think about is that there's still a chance to a small window, but there's still a window to turn this thing around.
Well, we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. That has to be a primary goal,
and that's a tough one.
It's a tough one, and we have to transform our agricultural systems that are pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through a variety of ways. For example, the cattle raising that is done on an industrial scale is producing a tremendous amount of methane. I mean, if you add up all of the contributions of agriculture, whether it's producing the fertilizer or the land use changes and so forth, I mean, we're talking about a huge percentage of global greenhouse gases. So we have to do those things, but we've already baked a lot of climate change into the atmosphere right now. I mean, the greenhouse gases that have already been emitted that are in the atmosphere are going to continue the warming trends. So we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that while we stop emitting more greenhouse gases. Meanwhile, the vulnerable communities will continue to feel the impacts.
Some of the people are being displaced around the world on certain islands here or there. Just being 100% displaced. This is a serious, probably the most serious thing going.
I mean, there's some serious things. There's some serious things going on, but it's global.
Yes.
By definition,
yes,
it's inescapable, and it has very wide-ranging impacts.
Yeah, some people talk about this as being sort of a prominent component of the sort of poly-crisis. To get to your point, there are a lot of things going on. I mean, we're coming out the end of one epidemic, literally worldwide epidemic, and others are
on the horizon.
And maybe not too far away. And then there's all the political strife. There's the economic disparities. There's the climate crisis. I mean, there are a whole variety of things that are sort of at play here. And you're right, the climate is an important component of that, and gives us a challenge to figure out how do you respond in the context in which you live. So the response in Northern California is going to have to be different from the response in the Midwest or in the South or in Brazil or other places in the world, depending on the local context.
What would some of those responses be? Could you outline them a little bit more specifically, geographically, regionally?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example,
Where you're not buying a Tesla in a lot of places.
yeah, I mean, yeah, there are opportunities for individuals, but there are also, I think, the transformation of agriculture, as I mentioned, it's going to look very different in California than, say, Iowa. In Iowa, it's almost wall-to-wall corn and soybeans. And about 40% of that corn is being used to create ethanol, which is then being blended with gasoline and burned to power transportation, creating greenhouse gases. So if you think about how you might transform Iowa agriculture, you begin to think about how do we get away from raising corn to burn in cars? How do we get away from growing soybeans to feed chickens and beef cattle in industrial feedlots while using that fertile, rich soil to grow a much diverse set of crops that actually feeds people and sequesters carbon in the soil. So that's sort of a design problem that is suitable for Iowa, but it isn't relevant to Northern California. So I just think we have to think about what are the challenges in places and then what are the opportunities.
Nate, what would you say are some of the economic ramifications of making some of these changes that would affect such large industries such as agriculture or the petroleum industry in America? Could you speak on that? I know that's a really loaded question.
Loaded question, and I left my PhD for economics at home. What's up, Alligator?
For anyone who's wondering who this ghost voice is here,
Producer Donnie, no more cowboy Donnie.
This is my co-producer, my son Donnie. He's here with us, but he's sitting this out, and I continue doing what you're doing though. Okay.
Well, for example, I know with petroleum specifically, sort of the output of wanting to move this movement in America towards electronic cars or electric vehicles has been like an increase in investing in plastics and other petroleum-based products. Would you say that's correct?
Well, the plastics are being used for a lot of purposes.
Right.
Yeah, there's no question that they're being used for a lot of purposes. So, and coming from petroleum right now.
I mean, are they not intertwined? Is that not like a response at all?
No, they are intertwined, but there are ways to reconfigure the material economy in ways that has less of a climate impact. Yeah. But that means redesigning the plastics. It means redesigning the sources. They don't have to be made from natural gas or fossil fuels. But right now, that's the game plan for the industry.
Gotcha.
I mean, I think like there is a short-term cost and disruption. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which, even over a relatively short-term time horizon, being more, environmentally conscious is profitable. I mean, like if you look at the cheapest forms of new energy to construct, and it depends on where it is, but they're typically renewables in North America anyway. And there are things you need to figure out around grid resiliency and energy storage and that type of thing. But just if you're building a power plant today in America, you're not building a coal power plant, not because of regulation or fear from public retribution, just because it's not economical. So I think one of the interesting things to think about that is sometimes lost on us is the fact that like we're talking about efficient usage of resources in most of these cases. And, that should be reflected in positive, kind of real economic outcomes. Now, I think part of the issue is that the way that our system right now thinks about what is economically profitable is not very holistic, and it tends to be very short term. And so I think, in that context, there are, upfront costs in some cases to make investments that are required to transition systems. And then I think like we also have to be okay as consumers of, with more disruption. It's not existential disruption. It's not even disruption that really materially impacts our quality of life. In fact, it could improve our quality of life if it gives us greater appreciation for the, extreme comforts and luxuries, honestly, that we have in this country. But, does it make a whole lot of sense to be able to order a package and have it show up in 2 hours? Like, not really. Are we going to have power shutdowns in California over some period of time while we, make fundamental changes to our grid? For sure, but that's not existential. And, you read these, every time there's a power shut off in California, Wall Street Journal throws out an immediate thing just bashing, green energy and saying, well, this is never going to work. And, the reality is that like it is working. It's actually working quite well. And, we're starting from a baseline of 0, and there's this kind of binary framing of it of like, wow, like one thing was 5% worse, and oh my God, we can never make this transition. And I think we need to reframe our minds a little bit as consumers to say, wow, like 5% worse for like a planet that works over the long term, like that's a hell of a deal. I'll take that any day.
That's good.
What do you say, Ted?
Well, I agree that the renewable energy is becoming increasingly more affordable. I mean, it's compared to 25 years ago, it's so much cheaper now that it's cheaper than burning coal for energy. So now, one of our jobs is to retire these old coal-fired power plants that are spewing out a lot of greenhouse gases. The problem there is that there's a lot of political resistance from the coal-producing states. And so then we get into the whole issue of how money has infiltrated politics. And the fossil fuel industry, including the coal industry, spends a lot of money to support candidates who will go to bat for them in the legislature. So, and this is happening in the states as well as federally. But it nevertheless is a fact that renewables have become cheaper. And so I think the writing is on the wall. That what we need to do is figure out this just transition. So coal miners and coal mining families should not bear the brunt of this transition. We have to figure out how to make this transition. But and there are ways to do that. But that's just one example of how renewables are beginning to push the market in a different direction.
I mean, I also think like there's, going to be a ton of economic disruption from, I hate just throwing the term AI out there as a buzzword, but like you look at what some of these programs can do, and I mean, they're going to eliminate a lot of white collar jobs in very short order, just because the volume of work that are done by those jobs that can now be done by a robot is, 70-80% in many cases. And so you take, 70-80% out of the equation and you don't need nearly as many people. So like we're going to go through a lot of economic disruption in the coming years for a variety of different factors. And so I think, we do need to think holistically about the denominator of wealth is not the issue. I mean, there's America has $20 trillion or something like that of wealth. It's a third of the global GDP. So the amount of resources that are out there, the size of the pie is not the issue, but we don't have the social infrastructure set up to allocate that in a way that maximizes or even just kind of minimally achieves public good at this point.
That's a good point.
Which gets back to the issue of how that public good is thought about and how these resources are allocated. Because as Nate's pointing out, we have lots of resources, but the way they're allocated creates so many injustices and so much inequality right now that we have to ask ourselves whether we have the political will to address it.
That's the $1 million question right there. Do we have the political will to do what has to be done? It's not like should be done, which absolutely has to be done.
I mean, one of the areas of this country that's gotten a lot of attention that I've been watching carefully is what's called Cancer Alley in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And years ago, when I first started doing public environmental health work, I was asked to take a look at that claim that this was there was an area of southeast Louisiana that had increased risks of cancer and incidence of cancer because people in the Louisiana Medical Society were denying that it even existed. And so when I looked at the data at that time, it was apparent to me that one of the problems was that the way the cancer data were collected made it really hard to identify the specific area that lies along the Mississippi River there where Cancer Alley was reported to exist. And so fast forward about 20 years, and Louisiana has begun to collect the cancer incidence data in a different way. It's a more fine-grained way, so they could really begin to look specifically along that Mississippi River corridor where so many of these industries are located. Fossil fuel industries that are making plastics and chemicals out of fossil fuels, releasing air pollutants into the air on these communities, contaminating the water and the land. So that was the setting for this. And now with the new cancer data, studies have shown that yes, indeed, there is a cancer alley. People who live along that corridor do have a higher incidence of various kinds of cancer, and it's disproportionately felt in people who are economically disadvantaged and people of color. Those are the ones at the highest risk. So this is an example of the material economy, which begins with sort of the fossil fuel industry, and then everything that flows from that, creating industries that are impacting certain groups of people more than others. So this is the inequality thing that I'm saying that we have to ask ourselves whether we have the political will to address it.
Yeah.
I have a question about a section of an industry that you've mentioned a few times today, but I'd like you to go into a little bit more detail. The raising of red meats specifically. I know compared to other calories that you can consume, that has a disproportionate amount of land that you need and resources to allocate per pound. Is that something that can remain with movement towards a greener world, or is that something that needs to be phased out, or do you have any opinions on that?
Well, yeah, I thought a lot about this. I think that there are ways of raising red meat in what are called regenerative systems, where the cattle and other red meat organisms are integrated into a more sort of integrated cropping system, but you can't raise them in the industrial model that we're using right now and accomplish the same thing. So if you go into the Central Valley of California right now, where up until this year there's been a 10-year shortage of water, and you find these enormous cattle feedlots in this arid areas. I mean, tens of thousands of cattle being fed with corn that's being imported from Iowa, most of which most of it's coming in from out of state. Alfalfa that's being grown in areas of California and out of state, which is a very water thirsty crop, in these feedlots, creating enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, which are creating air pollution, water pollution, nitrogen runoff, and so on, contaminating the water supplies of the Central Valley of California, the groundwater, so that there are many farming communities that cannot get clean water from the ground anymore because it's contaminated with nitrogen from these feedlots. So it's a redesign of the agricultural system, and at the heart of it is this red meat thing. Now, having said that, in the United States, I mean, I was astounded at this. But people in the United States, on average, eat 3 to 4 times more red meat annually than they need for health purposes. While there are people around the world, in other areas of the world, that would benefit from eating some nutritious red meat. So it's another one of these inequity things that I don't want to just bash meat, except to say that there are ways of producing meat, dietary meat, that can address the climate problem and other environmental problems while thinking about the nutritional value of it for other people.
Yeah, the red meat issue is an interesting one because it's extremely effective right now as a political wedge to say that, there are many folks that eat a lot of red meat, and it can be very effective to come to them and say, hey, these people that want to make an impact on preserving a hospitable and beautiful planet beyond the next 50 or 100 years are telling you that you have to fundamentally alter your way of life. And, they're the same people that live in these coastal cities, and they talk down to you, and they have all these fancy degrees, and they're trying to take your hamburger. And I think, I don't necessarily know how to overcome that dialogue that's getting stuck, because I think, the reality is, no, look, we're a free country, you're a free person, you can continue to, consume all the meat that you want. Having said that, it is just objectively true that the way that we are going about this is going to, destroy our planet. That's just a fact, and you can still continue to make that choice if you want. You're a free human being. But I do think it's interesting because the red meat one, and there are other ones, the banning of gas stoves and these other things can become really effective wedge issues. And, I'm not quite sure how to get around that, because I think it really hampers our ability to have a productive discourse on this as a society, which is, what we need ultimately to move forward on it.
Yeah, I agree that it certainly is a wedge issue. I do think that one way to think about the meat issue is to think about the true cost of food. If we were to actually charge for red meat at the supermarket, all of the costs that are embedded, it would change people's calculus fairly quickly, because the climate impacts, the health impacts
health impacts are extremely substantial too. That's the other irony of this, is it leads to a lot of chronic issues that are very costly.
And taxpayers and individuals and their families are paying those costs. So those are externalized from the cost of food at the supermarket. If they were brought into the cost of food, we would see different price structures.
That's a good point.
The cows themselves, the animals we use for food, they are actually beneficial to the earth if they are raised in the right way. The problem is those industrialized holding pens where they hold them. They got thousands of cattle, and because the buffalo kept the grasslands healthy, because they came through and they tore up the earth, and the earth needs that. The cows do the same thing if they're in an open pasture and whatever. They're beneficial to the earth. It's those doggone big whatever you call them, that those big feet.
Well, and it's pretty, I don't know if any of you guys have ever flown over the Central Valley at low altitude, especially now it's a little bit greener, but when there was a drought, if you're in a small plane like a Cessna, or something like that, it is stark, because you do see some green patches where there's agriculture, but there's, increasingly in the past couple of years, there's been a lot less of that, and we've been tearing up really water-intensive crops like almonds and that sort of thing. It's basically like a desert of essentially arid land, and then black. And these feedlots are completely black. They're an acre black, or maybe, 10 acres. They're not that large, and there's 1,000 cows.
It's scary.
In there. Yeah.
It's scary, It's a blot on the land. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you look at it, you see. I hate to use the word. This is evil.
You can smell it too in an air. If you're at 2,000 feet in an airplane, you will smell it. It's pretty wild. Yeah.
So on the other hand, here in this area of Northern California, here at least we have a number of ranchers that are really pretty committed to the rotational grazing that you were talking about, Alligator.
Yes.
Where the cattle are kept on land for a period of time,
and then they move them someplace else.
Move to another pasture, and let the grasses regenerate. Meanwhile, their activity on the land is helping to get the manure down into the soil. There is carbon sequestration going on with that kind of grazing that is not happening in feedlots.
Well, I think it is interesting, though, that this crisis that we face prompts these types of conversations, because these probably aren't the type of conversations you guys were having when you were 26 and 30, like Donnie and me, you know? So, like, there's so much potential for us to really live in a societal framework that is far more evolved, equitable, and also just higher quality for each individual, where people are honestly genuinely happier. I mean, I just keep coming back to the fact that, like, the amount of wealth, at least in America, that we have, it is so far beyond what is required to build really any society that we would want to build. And so I do think we have a unique moment in time. It's almost like you could, I wish I had a whiteboard as someone that uses whiteboards a lot, but you've got kind of a trend of escalating climactic and, you know, other polycrises. And then you've got like another wave that's kind of cresting around the awareness of those and the awareness of the ways in which we are not operating in a way that is sustainable or equitable. And at a certain point, I think that wave does crest to enough momentum that it really does become the political zeitgeist. And the question is really just, what does kind of the intersection of those two things look like? And, you know, can we pull forward the crest of that wave of kind of consciousness, for lack of a better word, to the point that we avoid the worst outcomes of these crises? And it's unclear at this point. I mean, that's a coin flip at best.
It is unclear, but I like the way you're thinking about it in terms of putting pressure on the system in the ways that make the most sense for your context and your capacities, in ways that try to nudge the system into a way that is more sustainable.
I mean, this is a fucking cool book. Like, this book has some great ideas in it, you know, and we're at a point where there's engagement on those topics. Yep. Not as much as there ultimately needs to be, but I think there's definitely momentum.
You know, I just made a decision here. We're going to close this one out.
Okay, we're going to come back.
Take a break.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back and continue this conversation. But we're talking about a situation that I remember when I was young. I don't know why I was like this. I was always against technology. I remember when they first brought tractors into the area I was growing up in, and I hated them. I said, no. You know, these things, look at this. They spearing all this smoke out of this thing, and they leaking oil and stuff. I said, look, when we apply on horses and mules, they open up the earth. If they want to take a dump, they take a shit. It's fertilizing the earth. You know what I mean? So I was always against that. And recently I saw listening to the young people's music, whatever they call it, the hip hop, hop hip, or whatever the hell they call it. But I saw this young cowboy, young guy in a cowboy outfit, and the Old Town Road, I think the song is called. You know, yeah. And I said, oh, a young cowboy, okay. And he had this chorus to this song that I really liked. Then he started talking about these lyrics, and I realized, wait a minute, he knows nothing about this. So I sort of rewrote the thing myself. I'm going to do it to close this show out. Because I talk about the muse and all of that kind of stuff. But we're going to close this one out. This has been really fun. We're going to take a little break. We're going to come back and continue, okay?
Episode 2.